great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So let's talk a little bit about grand strategy, which I think incorporates politics and diplomacy, military, and society. So that kind of also defines Nato, I think, and cyberspace, right? Cyber is kind of our connection to a machine called the internet, but it's everything human, right? So it's romance and business and politics, and whether it's good or bad, somehow it has a connection to the internet. And NATO has also realized this, right? So at the highest levels of the world, this is being debated. You can see how big NATO it is. Essentially, it stretches from, the Hawaii to Estonia, which is across the bay. So what is NATO? NATO is an alliance, right? It's an alliance of democracies, rule of law-based countries that are seeking to defend each other, ultimately with a clause called Article 5. Now, Article 5 is something that says if one nation is attacked, all the nations will defend, right? So it's important to know that there's always sort of a voluntary, no obligation element to it. And yet the alliance keeps growing and growing, right? So in 1949 was the first group, right? And then in the 50s, and then in the 90s, 2004, it came as far as Estonia. And I just was in Ukraine. I spent a couple of years in Ukraine recently, and it is policy in Ukraine now that they will join NATO and the EU as soon as possible, right? So if you go to a government meeting in Ukraine, not the NATO flag, but present at every meeting is the European Union flag. They're not in the European Union, but this is where they want to go. This is where they want to be. And I think that the European Union and NATO are really the highest things that humans have achieved, right? It's beyond the nation state. It's the nation states that are committed to democracy and the rule of law and expanding a democratic space for humans. And so Article 5 is very important. Now, Article 5 affected me and my family very personally. In 2007, I had a call. I was then the cyber division chief at NCIS, like the TV show, if you've ever seen it. And it's basically NCIS does for the US Navy law enforcement and counterintelligence around the world. So I had been there since an office that was started in 1999, looking at the connection between network security and national security at the Pentagon. And in 2007, the Estonian president was at the White House, and among the things being debated were Article 5, because Estonia raised its hand and said, we're under attack, right? Now, there were jokes at the time about this, right? How can you be under attack? There's no tanks, no planes, no ships that have crossed the border. But I think Estonia will always go down as the case study in which national security thinkers sort of realized that times were changing, right? And we had become dependent on information technology. Right? Computers are used not only to fulfill our personal desires and dreams, but also for nation states. In Estonia, they have the highest per capita online voting, for example. And so if you become dependent on IT, what happens when it is taken away? Right? And so there are a few things you can do with a cyber attack. You can steal data, you can block data, or you can manipulate it, right? And we saw examples of all these in 2007, only they were rudimentary, but still it was, as Wired magazine called it, Web War I, right? What do you do about this? And so in the middle of the crisis, actually, I got a call from the Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy who said, we would like for you to move your family to Tallinn, Estonia. And I immediately said yes when he said that it's a small country located on the Mediterranean, right? But seriously, I still have a strong relationship with Estonia, love it, be going there tomorrow to have a reunion of researchers. And I was so fortunate to be the first foreign researcher posted there. And now it's 25 nations strong, so that much in a dozen years. The next year, when I was actually working at the center, there was an event which was seen in even more powerful terms, I think, to professional soldiers, right? When Russia physically invaded Georgia, the important thing about this event is to put the known cyber attacks and suspected cyber attacks onto a timeline, and they really fit nicely around the physical invasion, right? So you had one company saying in the couple of weeks just prior to the invasion, there were botnets being created, right? There were websites created to disseminate malware that anyone could use to target Georgian sites. There was a still controversial pipeline explosion that was thought maybe to be a cyber attack and is still debated among analysts, but it happened just a couple of days before the invasion. Government websites in Georgia were wholesale denied access to, and content was replaced. There were comparisons of the Georgian leader with Adolf Hitler. Many things occurred, including twice the rerouting of Georgian internet traffic through Moscow. Now, all of these things are pretty important from a military perspective. What they showed was the connection, a strong connection that was first demonstrated in Georgia in 2008, but would surely be there for the future, right? A tight connection between what's called computer network operations and military operations, right? They would go hand in hand. And I think that no modern military is going to send in the troops these days without also sending in the hackers, right? This is just logical. So in 2010, we also became aware of something called Stuxnet, right? Which was computer network operation, cyber attack, that took it to a new level, right? It wasn't denial of service, it wasn't a website defacement. It was playing with reality, right? So imagine you're sitting in this bunker, underground, watching the centrifuges spin at a secret nuclear weapons production facility, right? The centrifuges are very precise, delicate items, right? If they go wrong, you wasted a lot of money and time. And so the code inside this bunker that wasn't connected to the internet, by the way, had the machines spinning not at their right speed, but too fast, and then too slow, then too fast and too slow, and eventually they would break, right? But you're responsible for the security of this system, and you're looking at the screen, and the screen is telling you that everything is fine, right? The system is working perfectly, but it's not. And so there were other examples about this. In 2008, there was the Israeli Air Force bombed a suspected nuclear site in Syria. And it was always a mystery of how they were able to do it without getting shot at, the planes, right? But it's suspected that a cyber attack played a role in basically, if you're the air defense sergeant, you're looking at a screen of yesterday's blue sky, right? When in fact planes have crossed the border and the pilots are already back having tea by the time you figure out what has happened. So Ukraine, I just spent a couple of years in Ukraine teaching at a university in Kiev. Here, this is Donetsk. So you can see the Donetsk airport that was just built in time for the 2012 Europe football championship, right? And you can see it a couple of years later after an entirely avoidable war destroyed it and much of the rest of eastern Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is a reminder not only that computer network operations, for example, I did a book for Nato, edited a book, and we had 20 authors and 20 chapters, and you can download it freely from Nato. And what we found was that perhaps there was no decisive cyber attack, but in Ukraine, you can't turn over a rock without seeing a computer network operation. Hackers, nation-state hackers, are very busy in Ukraine. But you can see, though, that the damage in physical space is quite real. And so Finland happens to be on the border with Russia, as numerous frozen conflicts, right, from Moldova and Transnistria to Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And Belarus is also really worried. If things don't go quite right in Belarus, they're also ready for exactly this scenario from Russian forces. So as we progress, I think in terms of the sophistication of the internet, the intimate nature of information technology that fits into our pockets and in our brains, it's really hard to defend cyber attacks because there's so many variables and they're evolving so quickly. Does anybody here think that the 2016 election in the United States was a hack, right? Perhaps the biggest hack in history, really. So three-letter agencies are very busy in cyberspace. You can see it. When I was in government, sure, but it was a while ago when I was at FireEye as an analyst, and I worked for this company called Komodo as a cybersecurity analyst. Whenever there's geopolitical activity, always look on the networks for malware. You'll find it for sure. Because this is how three-letter agencies are working today, right? They're collecting information, and they may also be blocking or manipulating information in rarer cases, but cyber espionage is huge, and it's an industrial activity taking place 24/7, 365. So when this summit took place, I can tell you that at Komodo, I saw a nice spike in virus detection in Finland on the day that it was announced publicly, right? So always look for network activity. It will correlate with geopolitical events in the newspapers, right? So I saw it in terms of weapon sales, in terms of battle damage assessment after air raids. I had a piece in the Washington Post just before the 2018 election showing in Russia and many other countries sorry, it blanked out. Basically the buildup of malware before elections. And in the previous talk, that's absolutely correct. Adware often begins cyber attacks. They're in strategic spaces, right? So if you're going to target Finland or Texas or Russia, even if it's your own country that you're sending out malware in, you often do it first with various types of adware, is at least how we categorized it in the cybersecurity industry. So, 2 slides, one strategy and one tactics on what's happening at NATO. So the alliance in 2016 in Warsaw declared cyberspace to be a domain of military operations that NATO will defend as they have over the decades in air, land, and sea. Cybersecurity is a core task of collective defense. So it's one of the core tasks of the alliance. Cyberspace is something we're still trying to understand. And one of the ways that we are doing that is by applying what we already know, in this case, international law. So things like the Geneva Convention, right? If you're a prisoner of war, do you get to send an email back to your family, right? This should be fairly easy. But international law applies in cyberspace. The goal of the alliance will be a norms-based international norms. These are very new. I've been fortunate to be part of a Moscow State group and an MIT group. Over 10 years now, we meet every year, talk about burgeoning international norms in cyberspace. Strength through diversity of the alliance. I think this is for the European Union and NATO both. The size is so impressive, right? Thinking about from Portugal to Finland, right? The languages and cultures that are all seeking to develop a collective defense, politics, and with NATO in military. And there are over 40 projects ongoing in terms of cybersecurity between NATO and the European Union. So this has been seen for many years now, the fact that the politics and the military, they go hand in hand and support each other toward this objective. So NATO highlights the fact that it is focused on NATO networks, missions, and operations. So they're trying not to get involved in civilian space, right? So not to scare off anyone. This is trouble in the United States right now. The National Guard is very busy trying to protect civilian space right now, prior to the election in 2020 as well. And I think that's okay, but it does mean, though, that in countries with really bad human rights records around the world, the governments and the militaries and the intelligence agencies are not going to play a positive role, right, in defending elections in general. A cyber defense pledge has been signed by all the members of NATO that they will enhance cybersecurity and they will cooperate both proactively and reactively, information sharing and with investigations, other allies, right, in the alliance. They will integrate national cyber contributions just as tanks and planes and ships. NATO doesn't own any of those in a traditional sense, but has recognized that computer hacking, cyber tools, it will take advantage of as national contributions that the countries still own, right? If the United States loans a cyber tool to NATO, NATO has agreed that that is okay. They're building a cyberspace operations center at NATO, right? So this is important because of what's called deconfliction in the intelligence space. So there's a famous story in which once, maybe about 10 years ago, the CIA set up a jihadist website in order to attract potential terrorists. But it was compartmentalized, as a lot of things are in the intelligence space, and so not even the NSA knew about it, and so the NSA took it down, right? They attacked it and took the thing down. So you had 2 agencies, right, that had not deconflicted this. In the same way, in the Democratic National Committee in the United States, it is widely believed that the FSB and the GRU, 2 different intelligence agencies in Russia, were both on the DNC network and they didn't know each other was there, right? So no deconfliction. So this cyberspace operations center at NATO will be key to deconflict operations. And for those of you in the business space, this is really important. There is a NATO industry cyber partnership, right? So you can use that as a keyword in ICP to find potential openings and potential ways to get involved. In one of the areas, I looked through their literature, and they're really focused on smart cities, right? So that's one area that they're actively seeking to partner with to companies. And I'm sure that Helsinki could play a role in that effort. And finally, the malware information sharing platform. I just came back from Ukraine, and Ukraine is very excited, and they talked a lot about how they have just joined this program, and that now they have a Ukraine malware information sharing platform with the EU and with NATO. So Finland has signed an agreement with NATO, right? It's called a political framework. But I went to the Finnish ministry website, and it has fully 6 years of work went into this with many different agencies, everything from situational awareness to information sharing on cyber attacks. And so this is key. Finland highlighted the fact that it's the first partnership for peace country to sign an agreement with NATO. Further said that there had already been cooperation on cyber defense going on for years, but that they wanted to put this into writing. So this is key, right, for Finland and for you to know and to see. Found these 3 points on the Foreign Service website, so that there is a link recognized between internal and external threats. The 3rd bullet just almost echoes NATO's desire to have a stable, secure, and free internet. And one way the primary ways to get there is through international cooperation. So this is the NATO Cyber Center in Estonia, if you haven't been there. And we have some big projects ongoing, like the Tallinn Manual, which looks at international law as it relates to cyber war. Already been through 2 big editions of that. Locked Shields, which is the world's largest now international cyber exercise, all hands-on with attack and defense. I think well over 1,000 people every year participate in Locked Shields, which is in the spring, and the Finns do very well. They've always been involved in the infrastructure and in also providing teams to participate. CyCon, which is, I think, at the end of every May, the International Conference on Cyber Conflict. So in 2008, the director asked me what would I like to do that year, and I said, well, let's hold a conference. And so now I think it's going to be in its 12th year, and well over in the hundreds of papers, so that's on a library on the website. But I think the most important element in the Cyber Center goes to the theme of this conference, which is people. Right? So here you have under one roof 25 nations, right, that you can go to and you say, look, well, your nation has signed a cyber defense pledge with NATO, which is connected to the EU to cooperate proactively and reactively on cyber attacks and cyber defense. And so here's a place where you can reach out to almost any country. And it's not just NATO now, but it's Sweden, Japan, Australia, Switzerland, and more. So that's there, and it's very close. So I think some of these issues, they really do depend on what happens in great power space, right? So certainly in Ukraine, one of the major concerns is, before we can join the European Union, before we can join NATO, we have to wait for positive political change in Moscow. But I would like to take this opportunity to say that me as an American, I'm kind of worried about what's happening in Washington, right? I'm not so sure ultimately that even the United States is going to make it as a country. I can't promise you that, right? It seems like right now things have gotten so crazy politically between red and blue, Democrat and Republican. I'm somewhat concerned that those who would support, let's say, polarization of life and politics and religion and culture I'm not sure that they're going to lose. And what if Brexit happens, in France and Germany and ultimately NATO? So these are not just important questions, though, for the alliance and for cybersecurity, but for Finland, because what happens in Moscow and happens in Washington and Brussels, I think, are really important. Once you start digging down into issues, you see that everything is related, and it's hard to disentangle. I mean, questions like the strategic importance of Gotland, for example, right, to international military crisis planning. You see how things are more tightly connected than one would think when they we depend on each other. So I think that grand strategy in cyberspace is easy to see, the logical relationship with NATO and with is really cybersecurity. It's very similar to political science, international relations, grand military strategy. They combine society and politics, and military power and diplomacy, and you really do have to be a deep thinker, I think, to understand and address these issues, and they go quite logically together. And because of my great esteem for the EU and NATO, I really wish them the very best of luck in figuring these out. So thank you very much for having me here.